In 1949, the National Museum in Warsaw launched an unprecedented traveling exhibition program in an industrial trucking trailer. This unexpected foray into mobile museography came at a time when the Polish cultural landscape was recovering from considerable damage and extreme loss incurred during the Second World War. Instead of mounting a reconstructionist exhibitionary program in Warsaw or any other urban center, the National Museum opted to reach out to the citizens of Poland directly by literally taking the museum to the people. Although the National Museum's Museobus was novel in Poland, it was not the first or the only example of what period museum professionals knew as the mobile museum or the mobile unit. Other examples proliferated in the United States and France during the early post-war years, such as the Artmobile at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and Poland even saw its own mobile museum boat appear by the mid-1950s as well. Of these, the Museobus remained one of the most well-known mid-century examples because its founder, museum director Stanislaw Lawrence, wrote early and often about the program in international museum publications. A survey of the literature on early post-war museography evinces a strong interest in discussing transatlantic cultural reconstruction and restitution efforts, within which the Museobus does admittedly align. However, most of these monographic projects highlight topics like the Monuments Men, working to recover looted art stolen by the Nazis, or the post-conflict reconstruction of singular museum institutions. Much less attention is paid to creative museum initiatives like the Museobus, which look forward toward the future of museography instead of trying to revive pre-war museum practices. In fact, although the mobile museum was discussed regularly in contemporary professional museographical outputs, more recent discourse on museum history has not yet provided a dedicated literature around either the Museobus itself or any other comprehensive survey of the mobile museum phenomenon. In this presentation, I seek to expand such existing scholarship by examining post-war experimentation with museum as site, material heritage, and museum education as seen in the Museobus, specifically within its first exhibition, to show how and why this carefully crafted outreach program was devised for and disseminated among Poland's rural villages. I argue that the Museobus responded to post-war upheaval by taking collections on the road to share with a new, more democratic audience, breaking away from pre-war expectations of aristocratic, site-specific engagement with heritage objects in museums. To do this, I begin by contextualizing the Museobus's debut with a brief introduction of Poland's post-war cultural landscape. This first section ends by formally discussing the Museobus and the development of its ambitious exhibitionary program. I next examine the program's first exhibition that was toured across the nation's most remote villages in 1949, including its impact and reception in Poland. My final section looks at the Museobus as the first decade of the post-war era closes, specifically how the program evolved to meet bureaucratic demands while persistently engaging with its desired populist audience. With this agenda, I will demonstrate that the Museobus revises the current discourse on post-war museums, replacing the narrative that these museums were largely site-specific institutions focused on recovery with one that is more inclusive of innovations engaging heritage and community. Experiments such as this one aimed at creating something new for the future, not rewriting the pre-World War II status quo. At the time of the Museobus's creation, Poland's cultural sector was at the outset of a long post-war recovery. At the hands of the Nazis, Poland suffered extensive wartime damage to civic buildings, including museums, theaters, libraries, and schools, as well as extreme theft, loss of life, and purposeful destruction of cultural heritage materials. To combat further setbacks during the early post-war years, the Polish state took control over all cultural institutions and their collections to better streamline their revival. This was the situation that Stanislaw Lawrence was working with when the Museobus was first devised. Lawrence was himself no stranger to these conditions, having served as the National Museum of Warsaw's director before, during, and now after the war. He was even responsible for rescuing some of the museum's most important collections while personally witnessing the destruction and theft of many other Polish cultural works by Nazi officers. After World War II ended, Lawrence resumed his position directing the National Museum, and he was recognized as the lead museographer in Poland. He would go on to serve as the main delegate for their national committee in the International Council of Museums, and he engaged often in the UNESCO Museum section's international conferences and publications on behalf of Polish cultural institutions. Recognizing that the loss of contact with Poland's cultural heritage was not siloed within its urban centers, Lawrence began planning for the new Museobus to visit the rural Polish citizenry as early as 1947. As such, the format of the trucking trailer was a natural choice, and its sturdiness and mobility echoed other examples of contemporary mobile museums that had the same aims of transporting and exhibiting cultural goods long distances away from their home institutions. Pictures of the Museobus reveal that, although its exterior structure is undeniably a large truck with a long metal trailer, the interior completely eschewed this industrial aesthetic. As described by Lawrence, visitors entering the exhibition space were greeted with a long, tall gallery, filled with a mix of both electric lighting from the truck's generator as well as natural light from a skylight above. Recalling pre-war European museum interior design, the gallery walls and ceiling were painted with a neutral gray-green pastel color. The exhibition furniture was comprised of a mix of fabric-covered plywood panels displaying drawings or photographs and 4 glass-paned wooden vitrines for holding objects. These cases marked a key functional element of the Museobus design, as they were fixed to the wall with hooks for safety while traveling, but they could also be rearranged by sliding them along a mounted metal railing. To Lawrence, one of the most valuable qualities of such an exhibitionary vehicle was that there was no need to break down the current installation between site visits. I propose that the true innovation of the Museobus lies not in its surprisingly industrial facade, but instead in how it so fully embraced a new, shifting notion of museographical best practices. Indeed, the way the Museobus achieved a future-forward approach is clearly on display, beginning with its very first exhibition. Rather than courting visitors to come inside the physical museum building, this mobile unit model employed by Lawrence and his curators removes such literal institutional confines, embracing a more inclusive public comprised first of post-war Poland's rural citizenry, and later its young people and the working class. The Museobus was not devised to restore pre-war museum services or reprise perfunctory exhibitionary practices. Further, it had nothing to do with rebuilding museum facilities, and it was not devoted to a viewership comprised of aristocrats or intellectuals alone. Turning to the inaugural exhibition, although the Museobus concept arose in 1947, it began touring in 1949. Entitled Mickiewicz Pushkin, in celebration of the 2 Romantic era poets, the first show was not only devised to widely circulate and provide access to Polish cultural objects from major museum collections, but it was curated with a message for the Polish people about their heritage and national pride in the wake of World War II. For example, Lawrence wrote of this mobile exhibition program that, quote, "It is characteristic that during this period of oppression, a greater importance was attached to exhibitions of Polish archaeology and Polish decorative art reminiscent of the times when the Polish state was being formed and developed." End quote. Co-organized by the Touring Exhibition Bureau of the Association of Art and Material Culture Historians, The exhibition illustrated the life and works of these two men, including their revolutionary roles as Polish patriots during the Enlightenment era. Visitors entered the single-room gallery housed in the main trucking compartment of the Museobus from the doors at its rear. Once inside, they could navigate the rectangular space in a U-shaped direction, as both long walls and the far end were lined with glass vitrines filled with relevant objects and facsimiles for close examination. The walls of the Museobus offered a gallery-style hang of images and documents with interpretive labels. Some of the objects included in this exhibition were reproductions of paintings and prints from the National Museum in Warsaw's permanent collection, as well as original works such as historical journals and photographs. The exhibition inventory prepared by the museum's curators lists more than 100 such items, and visitors were also greeted by an educational instructor and tour guide from the National Museum. Museobus Pushkin was a significant moment within the Polish museum program of the early post-war years because it not only debuted this new school of mobile exhibitionary practice, but it also kicked off a multi-year, highly coordinated national schedule of representing the heritage materials and historical narratives around Polish culture to the Polish people. It was the first event on the agenda that would eventually culminate in the 1951 celebration of the capital city of Krakow. The centerpiece of the forthcoming Jubilee was the exhibition titled Age of Enlightenment in Poland, for which Museobus Pushkin offered just a taste of Polish history and culture from this time. As described in a 1955 report by the Association of Art and Culture Historians outlining the Museobus's early years, curators for this exhibition took great care in their selection efforts. Viewing the objects on display in the Museobus as the, quote, main tool of educational activity, end quote, one curator noted the fundamental importance of this work as a, quote, ideological practice, end quote. As such, the original objects and facsimiles included in the exhibition were each chosen to demonstrate the revolutionary and patriotic qualities of their poet subjects and the progressive humanist atmosphere in Enlightenment era Poland. Paired with extensive interpretive labels written by these curators, viewers who would not or could not visit the national museums of Poland were meant to understand an important period in Polish history as one where the national culture was sophisticated and innovative, one to look back on with pride during the current moment of post-war rebuilding following the recent physical and cultural destruction by the Nazis. But how was the Museobus received by the people of Poland, seemingly falling so far outside of the established concepts of the physical museum institution and traditional visitor experience? Visitor data shows that even though the Museobus only stopped for half a day to a day at most per location, by 1952 the daily attendance was recorded as a staggering 1,000 visitors. The exhibitions even became so popular that at some site visits the bus remained open until as late as 10 o'clock at night. According to Lawrence, between 1949 and 1955, the bus visited 1,153 Polish towns and villages, accumulating no less than 1,145,000 visitors during that period. One way this was accomplished was through highly strategic networking. For example, there was an extensive planning done by the exhibition coordinators to establish relationships with local organizations and their memberships, such as various professional unions. This tactic of creating a social network to promote the mobile exhibition ahead of its arrival in a local community was successful even in the earliest travels of the Museobus, and interest in this program only continued growing in the coming years. As the 1950s progressed, the Museobus continued deploying exhibitions across Poland, but it evolved away from the initial rural-focused agenda in response to new bureaucratic demands. In this final section, I discuss this shift with emphasis on how the Museobus adapted its approach while keeping the Polish people at its very center. One major development arising from the Museobus visitor data is that this mobile museum was highly well received by the public, and it soon gained the attention of both urban audiences and state officials. The Museobus quickly thereafter became a feature in the Polish state's cultural agenda and national education program. By the middle of the decade, the mobile museum even received a ceremonial christening, and in the years that followed, it was also the subject of a short film. After that, attention toward the program grew quickly at the national level, resulting in the Museobus making stops in major cities like Krakow at the request of the Ministry of Culture and Art. By 1955, the redirected focus towards a more national audience was in full force, but it notably still sought out the new, more democratic facet of the Polish citizenry it would have during its early years. This revised interest in the Museobus's constituency was publicly discussed by Kazimierz Michalowski, deputy director of the National Museum in Warsaw, in his article about the Museobus written for UNESCO. Here, Michalowski concludes his summary of recent efforts in mounting circulating exhibitions in Poland by suggesting that mobile exhibitions such as the Museobus were of extreme value to society broadly, but especially to one specific sector above the rest. Quote, "They are an effective means of fostering culture and art in every section of the population and every corner of the country. The scheme is based on the principle that the propagation of art and culture is the best means of developing the new type of citizen worker." End quote. This quote suggests that the shift away from rural audiences was not simply organic, but was done as part of Poland's post-war recovery plan by formally intertwining the social good with education and industry. A few years after the Museobus's launch, even Lawrence noted his interest in engaging new kinds of museum visitors, especially Poland's working class. This moment marks a distinct change from the program's aims almost a decade earlier, in no small part because it comes from the Museobus's founder. In his 1956 monograph, chronicling the history of Polish museums and their collections, Lawrence includes a chapter on the mobile museum and other traveling exhibitions during the post-war period. Of special importance is his characterization of the target audience for the Museobus. By 1956, Lawrence describes the workers of Poland as benefiting the most from the Museobus, rather than groups like tourists or schoolchildren. Still, what Lawrence does not do is propose a return to primarily hosting museum education and outreach in the physical museum building, nor does he advocate for focusing institutional efforts on courting aristocrats through those same museum doors. In sum, almost a decade after the Museobus's debut, the approach of the program may have changed, but its innovative goals of reaching new, non-aristocratic viewers in spaces beyond the traditional museum institution remained the same. The Museobus continued to exhibit to a wide audience across Poland well into the 1960s, by which time the Association of Art Historians in Warsaw took over its administration. During these nearly 2 decades, the program reached millions of Polish citizens, successfully achieving its earliest goals of bringing cultural heritage objects out of the physical museum and into the communities of so many who likely would not have come to Warsaw to see them. In this presentation, I have traced the evolution of the Museobus during this period, illustrating that this bold program not only altered the contemporary museographical landscape, but that it also offers for today's scholars an important counter-narrative that begs to be further attended to. For decades, dialogue around post-war museum history has focused on the reconstruction of museum buildings and returning of collections, but there is also much work to be done around activities beyond the traditional physical museum. Although the Museobus was somewhat short-lived, it ultimately demonstrates shifting notions on how the museum could best reach its audience, where that could be accomplished, and in doing so, even questions who that audience actually is. Thank you.